Welcome to Intermediate Macroeconomic Analysis. Today, you will go through a brief introduction to macroeconomics, the science of macroeconomics. Today, you will learn about the issues macroeconomists study, the tools macroeconomists use, and some important concepts in macroeconomic analysis. What is macroeconomics? Macroeconomics is the study of the economy as a whole that addresses many topical issues such as 1. What causes recessions? What is government stimulus and why might it help? 2. How can problems in the housing market spread to the rest of the economy? 3. What is the government budget deficit? How does it affect workers, consumers, businesses, and taxpayers? 4. Why does the cost of living keep rising? 5. Why are so many countries poor? What policies might help them grow out of poverty? And 6. What is the trade deficit? How does it affect the country's well-being, etc.? Perhaps the three most important indicators of the macroeconomic performance of an economy are 1. Real GDP, which is a measure of the quantity of goods and services produced in an economy in a given year. Here we have US real GDP per capita in 2009 dollars plotted since 1900 all the way to 2020. And real GDP indicates the living standard. Here, the two main features are, over the long run, there's clear upward trend in living standard as measured by real GDP per person. However, in the short run, there may be fluctuations, that is, ups and downs. The second important indicator of the macroeconomic performance is the inflation rate, which is a measure of how prices are changing on average. And as you can see, the inflation rate has usually been positive but low in the United States. That is, price level increase on average but not in a rapid pace. Here are an exception. A couple of exceptions are, 1. During World War I, we have relatively high inflation rate. And then between two world wars, there is interwar periods, you have a couple of instances of deflations. Other than those instances, usually we have relatively low and positive inflation rate throughout our recent history. The third important indicator of the macroeconomic performance is the unemployment rate, which measures the fraction of those who are seeking work but not having it. And as you can see, unemployment rate is usually below 10%, but never zero, as you can see in the US unemployment rate since 1900. And the most obvious feature is the 25% unemployment rate during the Great Depression. Also quite impressive is the huge drop of the unemployment rate coinciding with World War II. And the unemployment rate often responds to shocks with a lag. For example, after each of the two oil shocks, it took a year or two before unemployment shot up. And if you want to look at the current data, you can type current unemployment rate and go to the BLS and you can see the recent data there. Now we have gone through three most important indicators of the macroeconomic performance of an economy, and these three indicators offer a description of the history of US economy. And in the following chapters, we'll learn more about each of these variables and how these variables are measured, and then develop theories to explain how they behave. And these measures are actually about the topics and issues that are politically charged. And economists study these issues by trying to understand and describe with a scientist's subjectivity using scientific method. However, reality is complex, so the economists have to build up theory and models. And the economic models are basically simplified versions of a more complex reality where irrelevant details are stripped away. And economists use and think in terms of these models. So these economic models are used to show relationships between variables and explain the economy's behavior and used to devise policies to improve economic performance. For example, you must have encountered in your principles class the supply and demand model. So why don't we look at an example of supply and demand model for new cars, which shows how various events affect price and quantity of cars. And here we assume that the market is competitive and each buyer and seller is too small to affect the market price. Of course, you may know that automobile market is not perfectly competitive, but if all we want to know is how an increase in the price of a steel, for example, or a fall in consumers' income affects the price and quantity of automobiles demanded and supplied, then it is fine to use this model. So here we can list important variables. So we can define the variables first. We can define Q superscript D as quantity of cars that buyers demand, Q superscript S as the quantity that producers supply, P as the price of new cars, Y as aggregate income, and P sub S as price of steel, which is an input. And we can figure out how these variables are related using a simple model. So now we can start building the supply and demand model for new cars. And we can start with the demand for cars. And the demand function is here listed as Q superscript D is equal to D of P and Y. Here D stands for demand. It's a function, that is, it's a function of, the parenthesis shows, of two variables P and Y. That is, the equation shows the quantity of cars consumers demand and how it's related to the price of cars P and the aggregate income Y. This is a general notation of the equation. We often are not concerned with the exact quantity between variables, so we'll often use the general functional notation. So the general functional notation shows only that the variables are related. So here we have two variables that are listed that affect quantity of the cars, new cars demanded. They are the price of the new car and the income, the aggregate income. So for instance, as you remember from law of demand, when price of a car rises, then quantity demanded of the cars may fall. So you know from that there must be negative relation between P and QD. On the other hand, if it is a normal good, then when aggregate income rises, the demand for cars should increase, so it should have positive relation between Y and Q. So when you have general functional notation, it only shows the variables that are related. And here, notice the capital D is just denoting a function. So because it's a demand function, they use D. And it's not multiplication, but it's a D of, how you read this functional form is D of P and Y. That is, the function is function of P and Y. So quantity demanded is equal to D of P and Y. That's how you read this. Whereas a specific functional form shows the precise quantitative relationship. For example, D of P and Y equals to, that is, quantity demanded equals to 60 minus 10P plus 2Y. So it shows exactly how much the quantity demanded changes when two variables P and Y changes. For instance, other things constant, when price increased by 1 unit, let's say, then because there's coefficient negative 10 in front of it, quantity demanded will fall by 10 units. So the demand is related to P in this manner, exactly how much the quantity demanded changes due to a unit of P change. Similarly, 2Y means that when income increased by 1 unit, then quantity demanded increased by 2 units. So you see this positive relation between income and demand. So definitely this particular function tells you that the new car is a normal good. And the difference between general notation versus specific form is that specific form exactly tells you precisely how much, that is, quantity demanded changes due to a unit change in each of these two variables, P and Y. So you can see that demand is related to P and Y in the relationship depicted in this equation specifically. So when you plot the function that we just looked at, that is the familiar demand function, and you can see this graph can be actually plotted. That is, the plot of demand curve is going to be downward sloping. Here the demand curve shows the relationship between quantity demanded and price. Other things equal, here the other thing might be like income, constant at a certain level. So as you can see, the demand is depicted in this price quantity plane. And here the price is endogenous, you say, then income is an exogenous variable in this model. And other things constant means that other things such as income is given at a certain level. Only thing that varies is the price and quantity demanded in this price quantity plane that is shown through downward sloping demand curve, which shows the negative relation between price of cars and quantity demanded of cars. Next, let's look at the supply relationship. Here, similar to demand function, there's supply function. So the supply equation shows that in this case, the general notation is such that quantity supply, that is Q superscript S, is equal to S of P and P sub S, where S depicts a function. S is noted as the supply function, that is a function of, so S, you call it S of P, that is price of new cars, and P sub S, the price of steel, which is an input price, that is. So, as you learned in microeconomics principles class, you know that by law of supply, there's a positive relation between price and quantity supplied. So you know that just looking at this general notation, P is a variable that is positively related to the quantity supplied. In this case, price of new car is positively related to quantity supplied of new cars, that is. On the other hand, as you'll probably remember from your microeconomics class, when the price of input increases, you learn that supply decreases. So there must be negative relation between price of steel and quantity supplied of new cars. So there are two variables that are determining how quantity supply changes. And one is its own price, that is price of new cars by law of supply. It has positive relation between quantity supply. On the other hand, price of steel should have negative relation with quantity supplied. And this supply curve shows the relationship between quantity supplied and price. Other things equal. Here, other thing, that is price of steel assumed to be equal, that is stay the same at certain level or constant at certain level. So you can say that the price of input or steel is an exogenous variable that is determined outside of this model. Whereas you see inside the model, you have price of cars and quantity of cars supplied. So in this graph, you see its own price, P, is an endogenous variable, and its value is determined within the model. Endogenous, within the model. So when the price of steel on input goes up, then the supply will shift to the left, as you remember from your principles class. In other words, you have to incur more costs to produce the same amount of output, that is number of cars. Therefore, it should shift up to the left. Now we have seen both demand and supply functions and equations and graphs. We can combine those two graphs, that is, at the equilibrium in the market for new cars, where we assume quantity supplied equals to quantity demanded of new cars. That is, graphically, when the demand and supply curves cross, that's the point where its equilibrium price is determined. So now we assume initially you're at the equilibrium when supply curve S crosses demand curve D1 initially. Now we can start from this point and can predict the effect of changing either Y, an exogenous variable, income, that is aggregate income, which would affect the demand to change, or the price of steel that we looked at before that would change the supply. Why don't we first look at the effect of a change in income, in this case, an increase in income. So when y, an exogenous variable, increases, then what should happen is that the demand will increase. That is, at every price, there's going to be more quantity demanded. Therefore, it's going to be shown as a shift of the demand curve to the right. So an increase in income will lead to a higher demand for cars. And graphically, that's what you will see. And this will lead to at a new equilibrium where the D2 curve crosses the original supply curve. You see that price increases from P1 to P2 and equilibrium quantity increases from Q1 to Q2 at the end. In other words, the increase in demand due to increase in aggregate income led to a higher equilibrium price and quantity. So that's the prediction of the model. That is, this simple supply and demand model helps you predict of an effect, that is the increase in income, how it leads to higher prices and higher quantity transacted in the market at the end. In other words, the amount of sales of new cars should increase and price of new cars should increase when there's exogenous increase, that is an increase in aggregate income. In other words, overall economy is booming. You can predict that in the market for new cars, there's going to be higher demand for new cars. This will lead to at a new equilibrium with higher prices of new cars and higher amount of sales in the new cars market. On the other hand, an increase in price of steel reduces the quantity of cars producers supply at each price, which increases the market price and reduces quantity, as you see in this graph. That is, when there's increase in price of steel, it's gonna cause supply curves to shift to the left from S1 to S2. This will lead to a change in prices from P1 to P2 to increase, while quantity decrease from Q1 to Q2. So this model shows you that an exogenous shock, that is, increasing the price of inputs such as steel, would lead to decrease in supply. This will lead to increase in price of new cars and equilibrium quantity, that is, the amount of sales to decrease from Q1 to Q2 of new cars. And as we went through this example, we could see that the values of endogenous variables are determined in the model, such as its own price and quantity demanded and quantity supplied. So P and Q are endogenous variable. The variables are determined within the model, while the values of exogenous variables are determined outside the model, such as aggregate income Y and price of steel P sub S. So the exogenous variables are given to you. The model, in other words, takes their values and behavior as given. And it says that when there's changes in exogenous variable, this will affect the demand curves to shift. So each of the supply and demand equations show the negative relation, that is, for demand between price and quantity demanded, and positive relation between price and quantity supplied. It is depicted along the curve, the movement along each of these supply and demand curves, or demand and supply curves, whereas the exogenous changes of exogenous variables, that is, Y and PS changes, will lead to shifting of these two curves. And we could use this supply and demand model to actually predict the difference between initial equilibrium versus final equilibrium when these exogenous variables changed that lead to shifting of these two curves. So in summary, the values of endogenous variables are determined within the model, whereas the values of exogenous variables are determined outside the model, and the model takes their values and behavior as given. So you wouldn't want to get confused the difference between endogenous and exogenous variables. But simply, endo means within and exo means outside. So outside of this model, Y and PS are determined, and within the model, these P and Q are determined when there's change in exogenous variables. So in other words, Exogenous variables are given, whereas endogenous variables determined within the model. Now, why don't you try to do this by yourself? That is, in the supply and demand model for smartphones, what are the endogenous and exogenous variables? You want to write down the demand and supply equations for smartphones, including two exogenous variables in each equation, and try to draw a supply and demand graph for smartphones, and then use your graph to show how a change in one of your exogenous variables affects the model's endogenous variables. So we'll do this exercise together during our live session. So why don't you write these down? I'll give you a couple of minutes to try this during the live session. So why don't you write down now in a piece of paper, list the endogenous variables and list the exogenous variables you can think of. And then we can actually go over this. But before we go over, imagine how these are related. So it's easy what endogenous variables and what kind of relation they have within. Whereas when you have exogenous variables, list them. Like, for example, consumers' income and what kind of relation they have, like positive relation between income and quantity demanded of smartphones. If the smartphone is normal good, then think of other things that you learn in principles class, such as what are complements and price of complements, how it's related to the quantity demanded, or price of substitutes, etc. So think about what are the examples of complements or substitutes and what else that may affect demand. Similarly, what may affect supply. And list those before our next live class and bring it up and let's try to discuss together 3 to 5 minutes. And then try to change what happened to each of these exogenous variables and predict what's going to happen to the price and quantity at each new equilibrium. In other words, let's try to do the same thing we just saw, that is comparative statistics analysis of what's going to happen to equilibrium price and quantities and predict what's going to happen in the market when these exogenous variables change. Now, in the real life, no one model can address all the issues we care about. For example, our supply and demand model of the car market can tell us how a fall in aggregate income affects price and quantity of cars. However, it cannot tell us why aggregate income falls. So we learn different models for studying different issues. For example, unemployment, inflation, long-run growth, etc. For each new model, you should keep track of, however, 1. Its assumptions, 2. Which variables are endogenous and which are exogenous, and 3. The questions it can help us understand and those it cannot help us understand. Finally, economists many times assume that markets are in equilibrium. That is, markets clear. So the market clearing is an assumption that prices are flexible, adjust to equate supply and demand. However, in the short run, many prices are sticky. That is, they adjust sluggishly in response to changes in supply or demand. For example, many labor contracts fix the nominal wage for a year longer, and many magazine publishers change prices only once every 3 to 4 years. And the economy's behavior depends partly on whether prices are sticky or flexible. And if prices are sticky in the short run, demand may not equal supply, which explains 1. Why there's unemployment, that is, there's excess supply of labor, and 2. Why firms cannot always sell all the goods they produce. And if prices are flexible, that is in the long run, when markets clear, then economy behaves very differently in the short run versus long run. So we'll cover most, if not all, of the core chapters of the textbook, which applies many different models. So today we went through chapter 1 very briefly, And chapter 2, next lecture, is another introductory material about data we use. And I expect you to have already read by the second class, chapters 1 and 2. Those are very quick readings, so it's not going to be too hard. And after we cover that, we're getting into classical theory, but then only chapter 3 first, because I'm going to get to chapter 8 and 9 first after chapter 3 and come back to the other classical chapters. So when you say classical theory, that's about how the economy works in the long run when prices are flexible. That may be like several years studies. On the other hand, in chapter 8 and 9, we're going to look at the growth theory, the standard of living and its growth rate over the very long run, which involves several decades long. On the other hand, at the end, after we go through both growth theory and classical theories, we'll get to short-run business cycle theory. That is how the economy works in the short run when prices are sticky. And these are like month-to-month or year-to-year fluctuations of the economy. So these are the topics that, or core chapters of the textbook that we're going to cover in this class. And the sequence would be very much like what I list in the syllabus. So we're going to go to chapter 1, 2, 3 first, and then 8 and 9, and come back to 4, 5. And we may skip 6 and go to 7. Probably we'll get back to, when time permits, 6 later. But then after that, we're going to go to chapters 10, 11, and 12. And chapter 6 and 13 are basically open economy macro. So we're going to get to them the last, if time permits. But we're going to go to chapter 14 first before we go to those open economy chapters. And I really warn you, it is expected that you read ahead before class to prepare well. And the format is such that I post the lecture slideshow first, and then during our live session, we'll go over some examples and important problems. So our expectation for this class is that when I post the slideshow, you're gonna have the summary notes taken for these slides, and then you come to class ready to discuss about the particular chapter I posted for you to take notes on, so that we want to have active class here. So I expect a lot from you, and I also assume that you have gone through basic microeconomics at the principal level and basic macroeconomics. So I hope that you can enjoy more advanced discussion of each of the topics based on the models we learn and the implication of the models and other related real-world phenomenon. So this is an intermediate level, and our assumption is that you have basic calculus background. In other words, you'll be able to take derivatives so that you can easily take derivatives so that you can solve, especially when we cover economic growth part and earlier chapter 3. So those are pretty difficult if you haven't gone over your calculus. So I really suggest you, highly recommend you to go to internet and find some nice YouTube videos like Khan Academy or other YouTube videos, lectures, or reviews of basic calculus, basic derivatives, and other basic math for you to review. If you think you have weak background in math, you should actually work hard on catching up with your math so that you wouldn't have much problem solving some of the problems that involves calculus. And it involves a lot of algebra too, and drawing graphs. So it's important for you to go over your math and make sure you hone your math skills next 2 weeks so that you will be comfortable with all the things we cover in this class and be able to solve each of the problems that involves mathematics. Finally, thank you for completing this chapter, and make sure don't miss any class, and I'll see you next time.